Welcome to Tell Me More Stories Told as podcast. Get ready to embark on well, quite a thrilling historical quest with us today.
We're diving deep, really deep, into the dramatic life of Mary Tudor.
Yes, a figure who, honestly, defied expectations at pretty much every single turn. You might know the name, maybe the shadow of Bloody Mary.
Yeah.
Believe me, the reality is a far more gripping and, frankly, complex story.
Absolutely. We've got such a rich tapestry of information about her, stretching all the way from the opulent palaces where she was born right through to the fiery stakes that tragically marked parts of her reign.
And our mission today is really to weave together the most compelling threads of that story. We want to pull out the surprising twists, the turns, the context that defined her incredibly tumultuous era.
Forget just dry facts. This is about understanding the person and the pressures.
Exactly. We're talking about a princess who was, first, the absolute apple of her father's eye, then suddenly cast out, declared illegitimate.
A massive fall from grace.
Huge. Only to then seize the throne of England against, let's be honest, some pretty staggering odds. We'll explore her passionate, some might even say desperate, attempts to reshape England's religious soul and the seismic reactions that provoked. This is pure Tudor drama.
So let's set the stage. Where does her story begin? She enters the world February 18th, 1516.
Right, at the Palace of Placentia in Greenwich. Pretty grand start.
A very grand start. But what's crucial to grasp right from the outset is that she was the only child of King Henry VIII and his first wife, Catherine of Aragon, to survive infancy.
Wow. Just think about that. Catherine had several miscarriages, stillbirths. So Mary was the one who made it.
Imagine the weight of expectation on this tiny life. The hopes, the fears, all pinned right there on her cradle. She had to be the future, or so they thought.
The pressure must have been immense. Not just a princess, but the only living heir for a king, absolutely desperate for a son.
Precisely. She was christened Catholic, naturally, with really powerful figures like Thomas Wolsey standing as godparents.
And here's a detail I find fascinating. She became a godmother herself while still just a child.
It really gives you a glimpse into the formal, almost performative nature of royal life, even for someone so young.
Everything had significance. And her upbringing reflected that, right? She had a governess, the Countess of Salisbury.
Yes, and Sir John Hussey as her chamberlain. Names that, interestingly, will echo later in much more dramatic circumstances.
Foreshadowing. But it wasn't all just ceremony. Young Mary was apparently quite sharp.
Oh, incredibly so. Precocious is the word. At just 4.5 years old, she played the virginals. That's a type of early keyboard instrument for a visiting French delegation.
4.5, playing for diplomats.
Right.
Impressive. A tiny princess already performing on the international stage.
She was definitely a talent. Her education was taken very seriously, guided closely by her mother, Catherine, who even consulted the great humanist scholar Juan Luis Vives.
So proper classical education then.
Absolutely. By the time she was 9, Mary could read and write Latin fluently. She also studied French, Spanish, music, dance, possibly even Greek. This wasn't just about appearances. She was being groomed for a significant role.
It sounds like Henry VIII, initially anyway, was completely charmed by her. Didn't he boast she never cried?
He reportedly did. But, beneath that fatherly affection, the ever-present need for a male heir always cast this long shadow.
Ah, yes. The great Tudor obsession.
That's the one. While he undoubtedly felt affection for Mary, the political imperative, the need for a son to secure the dynasty, was just this constant undercurrent.
And that tension grew.
It did. When she was 9, she was sent off to the Welsh border, sort of symbolically heading the Council of Wales in the marches.
So like holding court.
Essentially, yes. She had her own miniature court at Ludlow Castle. Some people even started calling her the Princess of Wales, though technically she was never formally given that title.
But it showed intent. Henry projecting authority through her.
Exactly, giving her a taste of governance, even if it was largely symbolic at that stage.
Okay, so she's this cherished, gifted young princess, but already the path is looking complicated. And then come the marriage negotiations. Seems like she was quite the pawn on the European chessboard.
Oh, absolutely. A highly desirable pawn. Throughout her childhood, a truly dizzying array of potential husbands were considered.
Like who?
Well, there was the Dauphin of France. The contract was actually repudiated later. Then her own cousin, Emperor Charles V. That engagement was broken off too.
Busy diplomatic scene.
Very. Then maybe King Francis I himself or his second son, Henry, Duke of Orleans. The treaty was signed there, but the alliance happened without the marriage in the end.
So lots of near misses.
Tons. Even a suggestion to marry her Scottish cousin, James V, went nowhere. What all these shifting possibilities really underscore is just how precarious royal power was.
And how princesses were seen primarily as strategic assets.
Precisely. Her personal feelings, often secondary, maybe even irrelevant, to the dynastic needs of England and the complex game of European politics.
A high-stakes game indeed. But all these international maneuvers were soon completely overshadowed by the earthquake happening right inside her own family.
This is the pivot. The point where Mary's life takes that truly dramatic, incredibly painful turn. Henry's desperation for a male heir and his, well, infatuation with Anne Boleyn led him down a path that would just shatter Mary's world.
He wanted out of the marriage to Catherine, the annulment attempt.
He did. But Pope Clement VII, partly influenced by Catherine's powerful nephew, Emperor Charles V, wouldn't grant it. He resisted.
And Henry, never one to take no for an answer.
Decided to reinterpret scripture, didn't he? He used a passage from Leviticus to argue his marriage to Catherine was invalid because she'd been briefly married to his older brother Arthur years before.
Even though Catherine always maintained that first marriage was never actually consummated.
Exactly. She stood firm on that. And Pope Julius II had even issued a special dispensation for her marriage to Henry in the first place. But Henry was, he wasn't backing down.
The pressure must have been immense on everyone, especially Mary.
Oh, definitely. From around 1531, the strain really started to show on Mary physically and emotionally. She suffered from irregular menstruation, bouts of depression. It's hard to separate the physical toll from the emotional turmoil.
And she was isolated.
Increasingly so.
Yeah.
Sent away from court, even forbidden from seeing her own mother, Catherine. Imagine that.
Terrible.
Yeah.
Then came 1533, a truly earth-shattering year.
It was. Henry secretly married Anne Boleyn. Then Thomas Cranmer, the new Archbishop of Canterbury, declared Henry's marriage to Catherine void and his new union with Anne valid, a direct defiance of Rome.
And that was it, the break. Henry rejected the Pope's authority, declared himself supreme head of the Church of England.
A revolution, really, and the consequences for Catherine and Mary were immediate and brutal. Catherine was stripped of her title as queen, demoted to Dowager Princess of Wales,
And
declared illegitimate. Her title of princess gone. She became simply the Lady Mary. Her entire household was dissolved.
just gone overnight.
Pretty much. And then, the ultimate humiliation, she was sent to live in the household of her infant half-sister, Elizabeth, Anne Boleyn's daughter.
Wow. From heir apparent to lady-in-waiting to her own baby half-sister, the psychological blow must have been crushing.
Unimaginable. And Mary, showing that streak of Tudor stubbornness, refused to acknowledge Anne as queen or Elizabeth as a princess.
Which must have infuriated Henry.
Oh, absolutely enraged him. She was frequently unwell during this period, and her own physician actually attributed it to the ill treatment she was receiving. It's frankly amazing she held herself together. It was a period of intense suffering, no doubt. Her main lifeline seems to have been the imperial ambassador, Eustace Chapuis. He became a close advisor, a confidant.
Someone on her side, at least.
Yes, because her relationship with her father completely broke down. They reportedly didn't speak for 3 whole years.
3 years, with her own father, the king.
Incredible, isn't it? And perhaps most cruelly, when Catherine lay dying in 1536, Mary was denied permission to visit her mother one last time.
Oh, that's heartbreaking.
Catherine's death left Mary utterly inconsolable.
It's just remarkable that she maintained her Catholic faith and her spirit through such a brutal adolescence. But the Tudor roller coaster wasn't done, was it? Anne Boleyn's fall was next.
Indeed. Anne Boleyn was executed on charges of treason and adultery, and then, in another twist, Anne's daughter Elizabeth, just like Mary before her, was also declared illegitimate.
The wheel of fortune turns fast at the Tudor court.
Doesn't it just? Henry then married Jane Seymour. And interestingly, Jane seems to have genuinely sympathized with Mary and actively encouraged Henry to reconcile with his eldest daughter.
But Henry had conditions, I assume. Big ones.
Oh, absolute ones. He insisted Mary recognize him, not the Pope, as the head of the Church of England. She had to repudiate papal authority entirely.
And acknowledge her parents' marriage was unlawful. And accept her own illegitimacy.
All of it. It was a monumental surrender he demanded from his own daughter.
How does she react? Did she just give in?
Initially, she tried to hedge. She submitted as far as God and my conscience would permit, but the pressure, likely bullying, was intense. Eventually, she was forced to concede fully, sign documents accepting all his terms.
A forced submission, really.
It seemed so, but it did pave the way for her return to court. She was granted her own household again, which must have been some relief, and her loyal attendant, Susan Clarencieux, was back with her.
So some semblance of normality returned. Back to court life.
Yes. She resumed her place, living at various royal residences, Hatfield, Beaulieu, Richmond. Her expense accounts show her buying fine clothes again, even gambling at cards. A reminder that even amidst all this high drama, there was still an everyday life of sorts.
Right, trying to carve out some space for herself. But the religious tension was still simmering under the surface, wasn't it? Didn't a rebellion happen?
Yes, the Pilgrimage of Grace. A major uprising in the north, largely fueled by anger over Henry's religious changes. And interestingly, one of the rebels' demands was that Mary be made legitimate again.
So she still had popular support, especially among Catholics.
Definitely. Though the rebellion itself was ruthlessly suppressed by Henry. And tragically, Lord Hussey, who had been Mary's chamberlain years before, was executed for his involvement. No evidence suggests Mary herself was involved, though.
More tragedy. And then Queen Jane Seymour died.
Yes, shortly after giving birth to Henry's long-awaited son, Edward. Mary actually acted as chief mourner at Jane's funeral and was godmother to her new half-brother.
So back in favor, somewhat, but still unmarried. Were there more suitors?
Oh, yes. There was talk of marrying her to Philip, Duke of Bavaria. He was a Lutheran, though, so that didn't work out. Then suggestions about William I, Duke of Cleves. But that ended with Henry marrying William's sister, Anne of Cleves, instead.
Ah, the famously short-lived marriage.
Exactly. And the fallout from that disaster led to the execution of Thomas Cromwell, Henry's chief minister. One of the bizarre charges against him was plotting to marry Mary himself.
It's just dizzying.
Yeah.
Plots, executions. And wasn't her old governess caught up in it too?
Tragically, yes. The Countess of Salisbury, Mary's governess from childhood, was executed in 1541, accused of involvement in a supposed Catholic plot. A really brutal end, apparently involving a clumsy executioner. Another stark reminder of the dangers at court.
Just awful. Yet Henry's own marital life continued its chaotic path.
After executing his fifth wife, Catherine Howard, Henry surprisingly invited Mary back into the royal circle for Christmas. She even acted as hostess. And his final wife, Catherine Parr, seems to have genuinely worked to bring the fractured family closer together.
A period of relative calm, then.
Relatively speaking, yes. And significantly, in 1544, an act of succession restored both Mary and Elizabeth to the line of succession after Edward, though legally they both remained illegitimate.
So back in line for the throne, but still with that asterisk next to their names. A fragile peace.
Very fragile, and it wouldn't last. Henry VIII died in 1547.
Enter King Edward VI, young, Protestant, and a whole new set of challenges for Mary.
Exactly. Edward was only 9, so power rested with a regency council dominated by staunch Protestants determined to solidify the Reformation.
So the religious pendulum swings again. Hard.
Very hard. Mary inherited estates from her father, but the religious climate became much harsher for her. The Act of Uniformity in 1549 prescribed Protestant services, the Book of Common Prayer.
But Mary wasn't having it.
Not at all. She remained defiantly Catholic, openly hearing Mass in her private chapels. She even appealed to her powerful cousin, Emperor Charles V, asking him to put diplomatic pressure on the English government to leave her alone in her faith.
That took guts, standing up to the King's Council like that.
Immense courage. She largely kept to her own estates during Edward's reign, rarely attending court. There was even a shadowy, failed plan in 1550 to try and smuggle her out of England to safety on the continent.
Wow. Things were that tense.
They were. The religious differences between Mary and her younger half-brother were profound and led to open confrontations.
I heard about one particularly difficult encounter.
Yes. At Christmas 1550, the young King Edward publicly rebuked Mary for her Catholicism. It reportedly reduced both of them to tears. But despite his repeated demands, his pleas, Mary steadfastly refused to abandon her faith.
That unwavering commitment to her Catholicism.
Yeah.
It really sets the stage for the next huge drama, doesn't it? Edward's death and the succession crisis.
Absolutely. As Edward VI grew fatally ill, still just a teenager, he became consumed by the fear that Mary, his Catholic heir, would undo all his Protestant reforms.
So he tried to change the succession, cut her out.
He did. Persuaded by counselors like the ambitious Duke of Northumberland, Edward attempted to bypass both Mary and Elizabeth in his will.
Who did he name instead?
Their cousin, Lady Jane Grey. A young Protestant noblewoman crucially married to Northumberland's son.
A blatant power grab by Northumberland, basically.
It certainly looked that way. Just before Edward died, Mary was summoned to London. She suspected correctly it was a trap.
So she didn't go.
No. Wisely, she fled. She headed east to East Anglia, where she held large estates and knew she had strong Catholic support among the local gentry and populace.
Smart move. What did she do then?
She acted decisively. From Kenninghall in Norfolk, she wrote a bold letter to the Privy Council in London, demanding they proclaim her as queen, as was her right according to Henry VIII's will and the Act of Succession.
Meanwhile, back in London.
Northumberland pushed ahead. Lady Jane Grey was proclaimed Queen of England, but it was a shaky claim from the start.
Did Mary's letter have an impact?
It did. Her servant arrived in London with the letter, making her claim public. And crucially, support for Mary began to snowball in East Anglia and beyond. People flocked to her side. She assembled a military force at Fralingham Castle.
So the country was rallying to her.
Overwhelmingly. Northumberland marched out with troops to confront her, but his support just melted away. Men deserted him. The Privy Council in London saw which way the wind was blowing and switched allegiance.
And Lady Jane, the 9 days queen.
Exactly. Her reign lasted just 9 days before she was deposed. Northumberland was arrested.
And Mary.
Mary entered London on August 3rd, 1553, in absolute triumph. The crowds went wild. She rode side by side with her half-sister, Elizabeth, a potent symbol of Tudor legitimacy restored.
Incredible. After everything declared illegitimate, sidelined, threatened, she was finally Queen of England.
Against all odds, Mary had claimed her birthright.
So Queen Mary the Chick, what were her first actions? Did she immediately signal the religious change to come?
Well, one of her very first acts was indeed symbolic. She ordered the release of prominent Catholic figures who'd been imprisoned under Edward, people like the Duke of Norfolk, and crucially, Stephen Gardiner.
Gardiner became a key figure, didn't he?
Absolutely central. She appointed him Bishop of Winchester again, and Lord Chancellor, a hugely powerful position. She also showed a degree of initial mercy regarding the whole Lady Jane Grey affair.
How so?
She seems to have understood that Jane herself was largely just a pawn. Northumberland was swiftly tried and executed for treason, but Jane and her husband, Guildford Dudley, were initially just imprisoned in the Tower.
Okay, so consolidating power, rewarding allies, like Susan Clarenceau.
Yes. Her loyal lady-in-waiting became mistress of the robes. Mary surrounded herself with those she trusted, many of whom shared her faith, and then the coronation, October 1st, 1553 at Westminster Abbey.
Finally, the crown is officially hers. She's 37 by this point. What's the next priority?
Marriage and an heir, urgently. To secure the Catholic succession and, crucially, prevent her Protestant half-sister Elizabeth from inheriting the throne. That was paramount.
So the hunt for a husband begins. Were there English options?
There were whispers. Edward Courtenay, Earl of Devon, was one possibility. Even Cardinal Reginald Pole, her cousin, though he was a cleric. But many in England definitely preferred an English match.
But Mary had other ideas. Or rather, her cousin Charles V did.
Emperor Charles V saw a massive strategic opportunity, an alliance between England and the Habsburg Empire. He proposed his own son, Philip of Spain. A widower, heir to Spain, the Netherlands, parts of Italy, vast territories in the Americas.
Philip II of Spain, a huge political heavyweight. But a Spaniard. That must have been controversial.
Hugely controversial. Mary herself became convinced that this alliance with the Habsburgs was essential for England's security in a dangerous Europe. She saw Philip's portrait. They were distant cousins through John of Gaunt. She decided this was the match.
But how did the English react? The council? Parliament?
There was massive opposition. Even though the marriage treaty presented to the Privy Council had safeguards trying to protect English interests, saying Philip wouldn't drag England into his wars, couldn't appoint foreigners, people were deeply suspicious.
Fears of becoming a Spanish satellite state. Higher taxes for foreign wars.
All of that. And crucially, the fear of the Spanish Inquisition being brought to England. English patriotism ran high. Lord Chancellor Gardiner, initially supportive of Mary, along with the House of Commons, actually petitioned her, begged her, to marry an Englishman instead.
Did she listen?
No, she was determined. But the unpopularity was intense. Anti-Spanish ballads circulated. France naturally stirred up trouble. It was a powder keg.
And it exploded, didn't it? Wyatt's rebellion.
Yes. So Thomas Wyatt led a significant rebellion, mainly centered in Kent, explicitly aimed at stopping the Spanish marriage, possibly putting Elizabeth on the throne.
How did Mary handle that? A direct challenge to her authority so soon?
She acted decisively. She rallied Londoners with a powerful speech at the Guildhall, refusing to be intimidated. Wyatt's forces reached London but were defeated.
And the consequences?
Severe. Wyatt was executed, and the failed rebellion sealed the fate of Lady Jane Grey and her husband. They were executed too, seen as potential figureheads for future unrest. The Duke of Suffolk, Jane's father, also executed. Courtney was imprisoned, then exiled, and Elizabeth.
What happened to Elizabeth?
She vehemently protested her innocence, but the suspicion was strong. Mary had her imprisoned in the Tower of London for a time, then placed under house arrest. A very dangerous moment for Elizabeth.
Wow. So the marriage went ahead despite all this turmoil and bloodshed.
It did. But the legal framework was still a concern. Under English common law, jur uxoris, a husband traditionally gained control of his wife's property and titles. People feared Philip would become King of England in fact and name.
How did they address that?
The Queen Mary's Marriage Act was carefully drafted. It stipulated Philip would be styled King of England only for Mary's lifetime. They'd rule jointly on paper. Parliament would be summoned under both names. But crucially, England wasn't obliged to support Philip's wars. He couldn't act without Mary's consent, couldn't appoint foreigners to office in England. Philip had to agree to these terms.
Did Philip actually want to marry Mary? Or was it purely politics?
Overwhelmingly political. Sources suggest he had little personal affection for her. He apparently told an aide the marriage was for political gain with no fleshly consideration. He wanted the alliance, the potential strategic benefits.
Well, what were those benefits potentially? An heir?
An heir would be huge. A child would inherit England and potentially the entire Spanish Empire if Philip's son from his first marriage died without issue. It was a massive dynastic prize. Charles V even ceded the crown of Naples and the claim to Jerusalem to Philip just before the wedding, making Mary technically Queen of Naples too.
So the wedding happened?
Yes. At Winchester Cathedral, July 25th, 1554, just 2 days after they met for the first time. They apparently communicated in a mix of Spanish, French, and Latin.
2 days, a whirlwind political union, and then hopes of an heir seemed to materialize.
Almost immediately. By September 1554, just months after the wedding, Mary stopped menstruating. She gained weight, felt nauseous in the mornings, all the classic signs. The court, her physicians, everyone was convinced she was pregnant.
This must have been exactly what she and Philip wanted.
Desperately. Parliament quickly passed an act making Philip regent if Mary died in childbirth. Celebrations began. Thomas Tallis even composed a special mass, Missa Pura Natis est Nobis, unto us a son is born, clearly alluding to the expected heir.
Was Elizabeth involved?
Yes, she was released from house arrest and brought back to court, ostensibly to witness the birth, though Philip himself seems to have had some private doubts about whether she was truly pregnant.
But the news spread.
Like wildfire across Europe. False reports of the birth of a son even circulated, leading to Thanksgiving services in places like Antwerp and Brussels. But the expected delivery date came and went. April, May, June, 1555. Nothing.
The waiting must have been agonizing and fueled gossip.
Endlessly. Doubts grew. Even Mary's confidant, Susan Clarence Sue, reportedly expressed skepticism. Mary continued to show physical signs. Her abdomen remained swollen. But by July 1555, it began to recede. There was no baby.
A false pregnancy. How devastating.
Utterly devastating. Likely what we'd now call a pseudocyesis, perhaps brought on by her intense, overwhelming desire for a child and heir. The emotional and physical toll must have been immense.
And then, to compound her heartbreak, Philip left.
Yes. In August 1555, with no heir produced and pressing matters on the continent, Philip left England for Flanders to command his armies against France. Mary was reportedly heartbroken, falling into a deep depression.
Did he have concerns about the succession now?
He did, especially about Mary, Queen of Scots, who was Catholic but betrothed to the French Dauphin, a rival power. He even tried to persuade Mary that Elizabeth should marry his cousin, Emmanuel Philibert, Duke of Savoy.
Why? To secure a Catholic succession tied to the Habsburgs.
Exactly. Keep England in the Catholic Habsburg sphere of influence. But Elizabeth shrewdly refused the match, and Parliament would likely have blocked it anyway. So the succession remained worryingly uncertain.
Okay, amidst all this personal and dynastic drama, Mary was also pursuing her other great project, restoring Catholicism.
Yeah.
This is where the Bloody Mary legacy really takes root.
Yes. Her commitment to reversing the English Reformation was absolute. While an initial proclamation suggested she wouldn't compel religion immediately, that didn't last long, leading Protestant churchmen were being imprisoned by the end of September 1553.
And Parliament followed her lead.
Her first parliament was crucial. It declared her parents' marriage valid, nullifying the basis for the break with Rome in the first place. It also abolished all the religious laws passed under Edward VI. Church doctrine was essentially reset to the more Catholic Six Articles from 1539, which reaffirmed things like clerical celibacy. Married priests lost their positions.
But the big step was formally returning England to papal authority.
That was the ultimate goal. Philip actually played a key role in persuading Parliament to repeal Henry VIII's anti-papal laws and return the English Church to Roman jurisdiction.
Was there resistance? What about all the monastery lands Henry had sold off? That was a huge sticking point.
It was the sticking point. A major concession had to be made. The confiscated church and monastery lands would not be returned. They would stay with their current owners, many of whom were powerful nobles and gentry sitting in Parliament. On that basis, the deal was struck.
So Rome gets England back, but the nobles keep the land.
Essentially, yes. By the end of 1554, the Pope approved the deal, and crucially, Parliament revived the old medieval heresy acts.
The laws used to burn heretics.
Precisely. This prompted a wave of emigration. Around 800 wealthier Protestants fled England for the continent. People like John Foxe, who would later write his famous Book of Martyrs.
And those who stayed and refused to conform.
They faced the full force of the revived heresy laws. The first executions began in February 1555. John Rogers, Lawrence Saunders, prominent figures. Bishop John Hooper, Roland Taylor, burned at the stake for heresy.
And Archbishop Cranmer, the one who annulled her parents' marriage.
His fate was particularly dramatic. He was forced to watch Bishops Ridley and Latimer burn. Under pressure, Cranmer actually recanted his Protestant beliefs. But then, at his own burning, he dramatically withdrew the recantation, thrusting the hand that signed it into the fire first. A powerful, defiant end.
How many people were executed in total during her reign?
The traditional figure, largely from Foxe, is around 283 people executed for heresy, mostly by burning. These became known as the Marian persecutions.
Were these burnings popular? Did they achieve their aim?
They were deeply unpopular. There's evidence that even some of Philip's Spanish staff were appalled and warned Mary it could provoke a revolt. Instead of crushing Protestantism, the burnings created martyrs, heroes for the Protestant cause, and fueled immense anti-Catholic and anti-Spanish feeling that lasted for centuries.
So the policy kind of backfired.
In terms of winning hearts and minds, absolutely. But Mary and her chief religious advisor, Cardinal Reginald Pole, persisted.
Ah, yes, Pole. He became Archbishop of Canterbury.
He did. He arrived as papal legate in late 1554. Pole was the son of the Countess of Salisbury, Mary's executed governess. After Cranmer's death, Pole was ordained priest and then appointed archbishop in March 1556. The Catholic hierarchy was fully restored.
And Mary's still worried about Elizabeth succeeding her.
Constantly. Given Elizabeth's known Protestant leanings, despite outward conformity, Mary seriously considered removing her from the succession altogether, perhaps naming another Catholic relative, like her cousin Margaret Douglas. But she never formally did it.
Okay, switching gears slightly beyond religion and marriage, what about other aspects of her reign? Foreign policy, Ireland.
Well, in Ireland, the existing Tudor policy of conquest and colonization continued. English settlers were encouraged to move into the Irish Midlands, leading to the creation of Queen's County and King's County, named after Mary and Philip. Today they are Laugh and Offaly. The main towns were Maryborough, now Portlaoise, and Philipstown, now Dingeon.
So extending English control there, what about wider European politics?
Things remained turbulent. In January 1556, Emperor Charles V abdicated his various crowns. Philip became King Philip II of Spain in his own right, while Mary remained in England. Philip negotiated a very shaky truce with France shortly after.
But it didn't last.
No. There was the Dudley conspiracy, an attempt involving Henry Dudley and other conspirators, possibly with French backing, to invade England. The plot was betrayed, conspirators rounded up, Dudley fled, and the implicated French ambassador had to leave Britain.
More intrigue. And this led back to war with France.
Eventually, yes. Philip returned to England from March to July 1557, specifically to persuade Mary and her reluctant council to support Spain in a renewed war against France.
Did they agree?
They did, but only after another provocation. Thomas Stafford, who was actually Cardinal Pole's nephew, bizarrely, invaded England from France with a small force trying to depose Mary. He failed quickly, but it was the final straw. War was declared in June 1557.
How did the war go for England?
Initially, there was success. English forces contributed significantly to a major Spanish victory at the Battle of St. Quentin in August 1557, but then came disaster.
Calais.
In January 1558, French forces launched a surprise winter attack and captured the port city of Calais. It had been England's last foothold on the European mainland, held for over 200 years.
A massive blow, symbolically huge.
Absolutely devastating for English prestige and morale. It's the source of that famous, though possibly apocryphal, quote attributed to Mary. "When I am dead and opened, you shall find Calais lying in my heart." It was a humiliating loss.
A tough end to her foreign policy ventures. What about the economy during her reign? Was it stable?
It was a difficult period economically. There was persistent wet weather leading to failed harvests and famine in parts of the country. The vital cloth trade centered on Antwerp was in decline.
Did England benefit at all from Spain's New World riches now that they were linked by marriage?
Not really, no. The Spanish guarded their colonial trade routes very jealously. Mary, being allied with Spain, couldn't exactly condone English smuggling or privateering in Spanish waters.
Challenges. But did her government try anything new?
They did continue. Some policies started under Northumberland, actually, seeking new commercial opportunities. They granted a royal charter to the Muscovy Company under Sebastian Cabot to trade with Russia. They commissioned a world atlas, encouraged voyages seeking links with Africa.
And finances, taxes,
Yeah.
the currency.
They struggled, like previous reigns, to balance modern government spending with a medieval tax system. William Paulet remained Lord Treasurer. There was an attempt to update customs duties with a revised Book of Rates in 1558, and they recognized the problem of debased coinage from Henry VIII in Edward's time, drafting plans for currency reform, though these weren't actually implemented until Elizabeth's reign.
So, some groundwork laid, but facing major headwinds. And throughout these later years, Mary's health was failing, wasn't it?
Yes. After Philip's visit in 1557, she once again believed herself pregnant. She even made a will providing for Philip to be regent if she died leaving a minor child. Delivery was expected in March 1558. Again, no child was born, it was another false pregnancy, or perhaps the initial stages of the illness that would kill her. By May 1558, she was clearly weak and seriously ill. It's thought now she likely had uterine cancer or ovarian cysts.
And she finally accepted Elizabeth as her successor.
Yes. Facing her own mortality, with no Catholic heir produced, she reluctantly acknowledged Elizabeth as a rightful next in line, according to their father's will.
And her death.
Mary Tudor, Queen Mary Tudor, died on November 17, 1558, at St. James's Palace in London. She was just 42 years old. It happened during a severe influenza epidemic that swept through England that autumn.
Didn't Cardinal Pole die around the same time?
He did, remarkably. Her Archbishop of Canterbury, Cardinal Pole, died later the very same day, also likely from the influenza. A symbolic end to the attempt to restore Catholic England.
And Elizabeth became queen. Philip's reaction.
Philip, in Brussels, reportedly expressed reasonable regret upon hearing the news of his wife's death.
Reasonable regret. Sounds about right for him. And Mary's burial.
She was buried in Westminster Abbey on December 14th. Eventually, her coffin was placed in the same tomb as her half-sister, Elizabeth I.
Together in death after such a complex life. Is there an inscription?
Yes. Added later by James I, it reads, "Consorts in realm and tomb, we sisters Elizabeth and Mary here lie down to sleep in hope of the resurrection."
Wow. Consorts in realm and tomb. That's poignant. So let's talk legacy. How is Mary remembered? Obviously, Bloody Mary looms large.
It absolutely does. That moniker, largely thanks to the writings of Protestant critics like John Knox, and especially John Fox's Acts and Monuments, his Book of Martyrs, became incredibly powerful and shaped perceptions for centuries. Fox's work was hugely influential, portraying her reign purely through the lens of persecution.
And she was the first woman to successfully claim the English throne in her own right, despite opposition.
Yeah.
That's significant in itself.
Hugely significant. She overcame attempts to usurp her, and initially she enjoyed considerable popular support, especially from Catholics who felt marginalized under Edward.
But the religious persecutions undeniably happened, and they were brutal.
Undeniably, and they were the primary reason for her negative reputation. Historians also note there's often a misogynistic undertone in how her reign and her character have been described over the centuries, the image of the bitter, vengeful, barren woman.
Has historical opinion shifted at all?
Yes, particularly since the mid-20th century, and especially with revisionist history since the 1980s, scholars have tried to provide a more balanced view, looking beyond just the burnings. Some argue her revival of Catholic practices was actually welcomed by a significant portion of the population, that English Catholicism remains strong. Certainly, English Catholics often remembered her reign much more favorably.
What reasons do historians give for why her policies ultimately failed to reestablish Catholicism permanently?
Several factors. Her reign was short, just over 5 years. That wasn't really long enough to embed the changes deeply. There were also natural disasters like the failed harvests and the influenza epidemic, which didn't help public morale or stability. Some Catholic historians also point out that Cardinal Pole, her chief advisor, was perhaps too conservative and notably refused to allow the dynamic Jesuit order into England, which might have aided the counter-Reformation effort.
And the practical impact of her other policies, the Spanish marriage, Calais.
The marriage to Philip remained deeply unpopular throughout. The religious policies clearly caused widespread resentment. The loss of Calais was a national humiliation. Philip spent most of the marriage abroad, leaving Mary isolated and depressed. All these things contributed to her rule being seen, ultimately, as fairly ineffective and unpopular by the time she died.
But you mentioned earlier that some later Elizabethan successes had roots in her reign.
That's an important point often overlooked. Policies aimed at fiscal reform, like the plans for coinage and the new Book of Rates, naval expansion efforts, and the encouragement of exploration and new trade routes, like with the Muscovy Company, these initiatives started under Mary, were continued and built upon, often quite successfully, by Elizabeth.
Interesting. So, not a complete failure on all fronts, perhaps.
Not entirely, no. The foundations for some later developments were laid.
Before we wrap up, just quickly, her titles and style. Did they change?
Initially, she used the traditional style: Queen of England, France, and Ireland, Defender of the Faith, and crucially, Supreme Head of the Church of England and Ireland. But that Supreme Head part was quietly dropped after Christmas 1553, reflecting her return to Rome.
And when she married Philip?
Their joint style reflected both their dominions and claims, becoming quite lengthy. It changed again when Philip inherited the Spanish crown from his father. Her coat of arms remained the standard quarterly of France and England, though sometimes it was shown impaled with Philip's arms. And her personal motto was quite fitting, perhaps: Veritas filia temporis, truth, the daughter of time.
Truth, the daughter of time. That feels very apt for such a contested figure.
Doesn't it? It suggests that only with time would the true nature of her reign be understood.
So summing up this deep dive, Mary's reign was brief, just 5 years, but incredibly significant. Her absolute dedication to her Catholic faith, clashing with the rising tide of Protestantism, and her controversial marriage to a Spanish king, these ignited intense reactions and left a lasting, often fiercely debated mark on England.
And we saw that truly unique situation: a queen regnant of England, simultaneously queen consort of Spain and its vast empire for a time. A dramatic, if temporary, realignment on the European stage.
Looking closely at Mary's life really reveals a woman of profound conviction, facing just immense pressures, personal, political, religious. Her story is a powerful reminder for us today, I think, of the complexities of faith, power, identity, especially during periods of rapid, turbulent change.
Absolutely. What stands out most to you, thinking back over everything we've discussed?
For me, it's that sheer resilience. The journey from pampered princess to outcast back to queen against all odds, and the tragic irony, perhaps, that her deepest convictions led to actions that ultimately damaged her reputation so profoundly. What about you?
I think it's the enduring power of that religious conviction, for better or worse, and how her story forces us to grapple with difficult questions about religious tolerance, state power, and historical memory. The Bloody Mary label is so persistent, yet the reality, as we've seen, is much more nuanced.
It really is. And if you found this journey into the dramatic life of Mary Tudor as fascinating as we have, please do make sure to hit that subscribe button right now. That way you won't miss any of our future deep dives into the amazing stories history holds right here on Tell Me More Stories Told as podcast.
Definitely subscribe. And here's a final thought to mull over. What if Mary had lived longer? Or what if her marriage to Philip had produced a healthy Catholic heir?
Ooh, the great what-ifs of history. How fundamentally different might the religious and political landscape of England and maybe even Europe look today? Something to think about.
A fascinating question. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive.
Thanks for exploring the depths of history with us.